Well, I have to confess to you that I do not like preaching on Zoom as much as I do being able to look into your eyes. I can't obviously see everybody's eyes all at the same time. And there's something about being able to look into people's faces, into their eyes, to be able to see what's the Lord's doing in them that draws some life out of me as well. But we'll do our best here on Zoom this morning. You know that our main text for this series is Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 to 26. We learned last week that Paul's main point is that the Christian life produces freedom. Life in the Spirit produces freedom, while life in the flesh, where we do our own thing, is not the freedom that we want, but instead it shackles us in sin and leads us to death. And Paul says the law was a nanny, guiding us when we were young in the faith, so we could learn to obey God and follow him and draw near to him. Freedom was not the discarding of the law, but rather to learning to live in the power of the Spirit, otherwise known as grace, so that we might fulfill the very purpose of the law naturally, like it's an overflow, learning to love both God and neighbor. In essence, we learn to live life as if Jesus were living his life through us. You will all get this example. Do you remember when the kids were small, we would say to them, "Don't touch the stove." Why did we do that? Because we loved them and we wanted them to live with the freedom to be able to use their hands for the rest of their lives for greater purposes than seeing how hot the stove was. The law, don't touch the stove, was a help to them. But as they grew, freedom was not the ability to therefore touch the stove and be okay. But rather, freedom was the ability to be able to say, we're not under discipline anymore, but we choose. We choose not to touch the stove because we know that there's a better way to live. Okay, this is a simple example, but that's what Paul was on about last week when we looked at the whole text together. And now we come week by week for the next 9 weeks and look at specific characteristics of what that life in the Spirit is all about. When we begin to follow Jesus, surrender to the Spirit, these things will become increasingly evident in our lives. They will happen naturally, and people will see Jesus in us as we bear witness to God. Today, we want to explore what it means to bear witness to God through surrendering to the Spirit so that his love will flow through us towards the world which he is redeeming. So where do we start? Well, let's dig a little into who God is so we can learn to reflect who he is in the way that we live. Come with me to 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 to 12, and we'll just do a couple verses at a time. You remember a few months ago, we dove into this passage in depth. So I don't need to do much with this, but just maybe a little bit of a review this morning. It says in 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 to 8, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." There, John said it. God is love. That's his nature, that's his character. And we discovered when we looked at this a few months ago that what that meant was God is the source of all love. In other words, all of love originates from him and from his being. So whenever we see an act of love, we know that the source of this was originally bound up in God's nature. But not only is he the source of love, he's the initiator of love. This means he is the one who starts it. It was not he who waited for us to act in love and responded to us, but rather the other way around. He started and we respond to him. So his very nature and character is love. John goes on in verses 9 to 10. Listen to these. He says it this way. "This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love. Not that we've loved God, but that he loved us, sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." See, John says not only is God love in his nature, but therefore in his actions at all times. And what he means by this is he cannot act differently than that. Every action of God must be love. Everything he does, by definition, is love. And so we can rest in that assurance. In his nature, he is love, and therefore in his actions, everything that he does is loving. But we come to the last two verses of this text that we looked at probably 6 or 8 months ago. And he says it this way: Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is made complete in us. So what's John saying? Well, he's saying this: God invites us to respond to him by loving one another. Now, there's one more thing in here I think we missed a few months ago. You see, it says in verse 12, no one has ever seen God. In other words, God's invisible in a sense, but God is inviting us to make him visible to the world by loving one another. See, verse 12 says he's not seen, but if you and I learn to love one another, it becomes evident that God is present and his love is complete. Or said in different ways, the invisible God is made visible to those around. You know, when we ask each other the question, where have we seen God at work during our week? We now know with certainty that we can answer this way. We can answer by saying, wherever I have seen people learning to love one another, there is God present and at work in that situation. Okay, so if the first point was all about the nature and action of God, and we were doing a little bit of reviewing there, he's love in his nature, he's loving in his actions. And the second point we need to look at is how we are doing, how you and I are doing, how we as a church are doing in bearing witness to who God is in the way that we live. In other words, do people see the love of God when they look at me or when they look at you? Well, I have bad news and good news. The bad news is that we fall short of demonstrating God's love. The good news, there's still time. We can grow in learning how to reflect his very nature and his actions in the way that we live. So I want to look at part 2 now for the rest of our time together. And I want to look at this, the reality that we've become image bearers. We respond in love to who he is. Now, I said there was bad news to start, so let's get that out of the way. The bad news is this, is that you and I fall short of the love that God demonstrates to us. I discovered this week that I'm not a loving person. Now, in fairness, I knew this before, as did most of you. But listen to a few things that happened in my week that just helped me to understand that. So one of the toilets was broken in our house, and it's been broken for a little while. Just the handle, not a big deal. But I finally got energy to go to Home Depot yesterday and buy a new toilet handle. While I was there, I got a few other things, and there was one particular thing I was looking for. I couldn't figure it out, couldn't find it, didn't know, needed some help. So one of the clerks phoned somebody in that department. I waited for 10 minutes. Finally, the guy comes sauntering along, looking completely disinterested. I ask him a question. He doesn't know the answer, so he saunters away, looking even more disinterested. Another 10 minutes later, he comes back. And I cannot begin to tell you the thoughts, the words I wanted to say. I cannot tell you how irritated I was at this guy who didn't really give me the time of day when I was needing to deal with a problem. They were not loving thoughts. Or here's another one. As most of us have been working at home, I too have been working at home most of the time. I go upstairs, I shut myself in my office, I close the door. And it's hard for Shelley at times. It's hard for her to figure out, is he home? Is he not home? Is he working? Is he not working? When can we be together? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are things that come up in the day, and Shelley comes knocking on the door. She comes walking in, and we have a good chat, and I enjoy it. Except that when she leaves, she sometimes leaves the door open. I want to be quiet. I want to close the door. So yesterday, sure enough, she comes in and being friendly and all that stuff. And then she leaves and leaves the door open. Okay, I close it once. Shelley, please close the door. She comes in about an hour later, goes out, leaves the door open. Oh, I was frustrated. I was irritated. I was bothered, and they weren't good thoughts in my head. And I wasn't kind as a result of those things. That was another situation. We were sitting at the table the other night, and all I could do was to think about, as we began to talk about friends that we had when the kids were growing up, I began to think about some of the ways that, isn't it weird that we don't keep the same friends our whole lives, but it seems to change? Why is love so short in our lives sometimes? Why doesn't it last forever? That was another one. Or there was another one that got me. There's some things going on in the States right now that I began to sort of, I was so perturbed inside of me when I was watching the news about this stuff happening in the States that I can't believe I actually thought this, but it came out and it was like, I hope they get what they deserve. And friends, I got to tell you, this wasn't just I didn't have to go back 8 months to figure all this out. These are the last sort of 48 hours. I had to stop and to think, I'm not as loving as I'd like to be. I need transformation. I need practice. For it's not in my nature, or darest I say yours, for us to be loving, and we need some help. Well, why is this so hard? Why is it so hard for us to be loving? And I'd like to give us 2 reasons and then lead us towards some practical ways that I think we can learn to have the love of Christ in our lives before we quit this morning. Let me give you the 2 reasons, but paint a picture for you first. So we've had the benefit of having Matthew and Ashley home with us over the last 7 weeks. It's been a great joy to have them around, and in a sense, I feel like it's a bit of an extended time with my kids, and I love it. Matt went for a run, I think Friday, might have been yesterday. Matt went for a run, and he came home only about 12 minutes later. I thought that was a short run. And he said, Dad, I can't breathe. My asthma's come back. My asthma's there. And I got out there and I was running and I just couldn't get air into my lungs. I couldn't breathe and I had to stop. And to be honest, he said, I thought I was going to pass out. I think this picture of Matthew's asthma is a really, really good picture of what or why it's hard for us to love. Matt was unable to get oxygen into his lungs because his lungs were constricted and the capacity for air had decreased. This is a picture of our issue with loving others. We have spiritual asthma. We're constricted in our love, and our capacity is nowhere what it should be. Here are the 2 reasons. Come with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1-4. You'll see it on your screen as we're going. The first reason is we still live in the flesh. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and he said it this way in chapter 3. He said, brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. Indeed, you're still not ready. You are still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? Strange passage. What's going on here? What's he talking about? Well, he's telling them to grow up. He's recognized that their love and loyalty is not really about being loving. It's selfish. They're still operating out of the flesh. Remember those times when kids, when they were younger, would come up to us and they would demonstrate, or they would make some kind of show of love? And you knew as a parent, you knew full well, okay, what do they want? They want something out of us, right? I think the same's still true for us as adults. We do the same thing with each other. It's a little bit more sophisticated than when we were 6 or 8 or 10. But I think what Paul's doing here is he's seeing through what's going on in Corinth. And I think he would say the same thing to us. We do it in more mature ways, but our love, or what we think is love, still comes from that fleshly side. It's still got selfish motives in it. It's like spiritual asthma. It's as if somehow we're constricted and we can't take in air, or in this case, We don't express or show love other than selfishness. See, we live by the flesh, Paul would say. We want to change people's behaviors rather than see them experience or receive God's love. We want to be right instead of developing relationships. Now, there's none of us that would have woken up this morning and said, I think I'm going to try to be unloving today. Like, none of us would do that. We want to be loving. The problem is we try and be loving in our own strength, and we just don't have it in us. It's not our nature. Instead, we need to learn to surrender to the Spirit. So the guy at the Home Depot yesterday, my natural, human, fleshly side, it was easy to write him off. He was slowing my day down. Didn't he know that I needed to get home? He was stealing valuable time from me because I had to go home and prepare a sermon on love. Why is it not that my natural inclination, my natural response was to think through, and this guy looks like he's going through a hard time. I wonder what happened to him. Lord, I wonder if you can use me in the midst of this time, even though it's taking up more time than I wanted. I wonder if you have an appointment for me with this guy, that somehow I can give him a word of encouragement. Somehow I can pray for him. Somehow I can just in some way demonstrate your love for him. See, gang, in our own strength, we fail. We fail to love like we want to or like we should. We're constricted. Which brings us to our second reason. It's not just that we have constriction, we therefore don't have the capacity. And I think we don't have the capacity because we do not know the extent of God's love for us. When we know the extent of God's love for us, it's as if not only can we get more air into our lungs, but our lungs expand and can carry more. That's the same way when it comes to love. John chapter 3, verse 16, you know it well. For God so loved who? The whole world, that he gave his only begotten son. Romans chapter 5, verses 6 to 8, we realize that what God's doing is he's saying that he gave his son, but it wasn't just at an opportune time for him. It was at the right time, while we were still powerless, while we were still separated from him. His love was so amazing that even though we had not yet loved him, he loved us. We come to Ephesians chapter 3, verses 14 to 21, and we realize in this great passage that we studied in just late last year, Paul prays two things for the church. He says, I pray that you will not be constricted, or he says it this way, I'll pray that you'll be strengthened in your inner being so that the life of the Spirit will be manifest. And then he says, and I pray that you will know how great the love of Christ is for you, so that constriction is gone and the capacity is increased. The bad news is that we fall short. The good news is that when we surrender fully to him, we learn to live in freedom. See, freedom, according to Paul in Galatians chapter 5, it doesn't mean just sit back and do nothing and say, okay, God, do your thing. Great Swiss psychologist Erich Fromm put it this way. He says, love is an art. It's not something we feel or a sentiment or something that happens to really lucky people. No, it takes work. We surrender to the Lord by discovering who he is and then obey him, putting into practice all that he's taught us to do. So come with me back to Galatians chapter 5, and in the last 2 minutes, let's just glean what it says here one more time. Paul says it this way. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. Do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. He says there's two kinds of life, two ways to live. One in the flesh, where we indulge ourselves and where we're selfish, and one in the spirit, where we learn to serve one another in humility, thinking of others before ourselves, and learning to love our neighbors, which is the fulfillment of all the law. Well, as we close, come to these verses in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 17 to 19. Listen to them one more time and let me make a couple comments before we close. Paul says, and I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Friends, Christ's love is wide, embracing everyone, regardless of race, age, or socioeconomic status. So therefore, if I'm going to bear witness to him, my love must expand and have that kind of width as well. I need to be intentional. I need to go. I think of the people building the mosque next door to us at the Robson Park campus, and how frustrated I am sometimes by the fact that they're upsetting the driveway, or they're getting in our way, or they're doing all these things. And yet every time I go out for breakfast with them, I come away thinking, they're not that bad. They're really nice guys after all, and I could be friends with them. And we need to be intentional and expand the width of our love. We need to be intentional and expand the length of our love. God has no time frame for his love for us. It's eternal. He loved us before we loved him, and his love will extend to eternity. So why is our love so time framed? Even marriage vows, it's become in vogue in our culture to say we will be committed to each other as long as we both shall love instead of live. Just an example. We do that with our friends as well. We get ticked off with one another and we move on, instead of learning to bear witness to who God is by learning to love through thick and thin for all times. And God's love is high. He takes us from where we are and he exalts us. He lifts us up to the highest place. His intention is that he will platform us. He will build us up. And yet so often my love steps on people, stands on top of people to get ahead, or I tear people down thinking that somehow this helps me. Even in marriage, so many times I see marriages, I have to work at this in myself, in my own marriage, where somehow it's like I want Shelley to be a certain way, so I'm trying to make her to be the kind of person I want her to be. That's not love. Love is not sameness. Love is learning to live in oneness, where we recognize who God's made the other person to be, and we celebrate that. Well, lastly, God's love is deep. He reached down into the deepest depravity to rescue me, to rescue you and us while we were yet sinners. And therefore, instead of seeing people through judgmental eyes and saying, yeah, but these people have those things wrong with their life, no, we must go back and see people again through Genesis 1 lenses, created in the image of God instead of fallen sinners, because we all fall in that category. Those are a few things that we need to practice. Paul's prayer is that we will be able to just take in all the love of God, that we'll be able to breathe it in deeply, so that we fill our lungs, in a sense, with that love and then be able to share it. We become conduits of God's love for us. He works through us as he's redeeming the world. Let me pray for us and turn it over to Phoebe for a time of communion. Lord, help me, help us to be conduits of your great love. Lord, may we live and keep in step with the Spirit, learning to love our neighbors. And may we understand your great love for us, which cannot do anything but help us to pass it on to others in much the same way. We bless you for these passages and the reality that in you we can learn to love one another. For Jesus' sake and for his kingdom's sake, amen.